The convenience store's fluorescent lights flickered as Marcus wiped down the counter for the third time that evening. At 62, he'd learned that keeping busy was the only way to make the night shifts at Quick Stop bearable. The autumn wind rattled the windows, and he glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until he could lock up and head home to his wife, Sarah. That's when he heard it, the rumble of motorcycle engines, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus had seen his share of trouble working the graveyard shift in this neighborhood. He'd been robbed twice, threatened more times than he could count, and had learned to read danger the way sailors read storms. But something about this sound was different. It wasn't just one or two bikes, it was a symphony of chrome and horsepower, at least 20 machines by his estimate, maybe more. Through the window, he watched them roll into the parking lot like a wave of leather and steel. The Guardians, their jackets red, emblazoned with a silver shield pierced by a sword. Marcus had heard of them, a motorcycle club that rode through the state, but he'd never seen them up close. They were massive men, most of them, with beards that would make lumberjacks jealous and arms covered in intricate tattoos. Some had gray threading through their hair, weathered faces that spoke of hard lives and harder miles. The leader dismounted first, a mountain of a man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories. He held up his hand, and the engines cut off in near-perfect unison. The sudden silence was almost deafening. Marcus tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the phone beneath the counter. But then he noticed something that made him pause. Behind the intimidating exterior, these men moved with purpose, not aggression. They were scanning the street, looking at house numbers, and the leader was holding what appeared to be a photograph. The bell above the door chimed, and 3 of them entered. Marcus straightened, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Evening," the leader said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone his size. "Name's Jack. We're looking for an address, 2847 Maple Street. You know where that is?" Marcus nodded slowly. 2 blocks down, take a left. It's the blue house with the white porch. Why do you need? We appreciate it," Jack interrupted, but not unkindly. "And we're sorry if we startled you. We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to prevent it." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, they were gone, engines roaring back to life. He watched through the window as the procession moved down the street, following his directions. Something in his gut told him to follow. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was concern for whoever lived in that blue house, or maybe it was something else entirely, a pull he couldn't explain. He locked up early, leaving a hastily scrawled note on the door, and jogged toward Maple Street. What he found when he turned the corner would stay with him for the rest of his life. The motorcycles were parked in a perfect semicircle around 2847, their headlights illuminating the small blue house like spotlights on a stage. But the bikers weren't looking at the house, they were looking at the man standing on the porch, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the fear in his face. Raymond Coulter had thought he'd gotten away with it. When he'd shoved his mother-in-law to the ground that afternoon, when he'd stood over 73-year-old Dorothy and told her she was worthless, that she deserved it for interfering in his marriage, he'd been certain no one would believe her. His wife, Ellen, was too scared to speak up. His 8-year-old son, Tommy, was too young to matter. But Tommy had mattered to someone. The boy had slipped out that evening while his father drank himself into his usual stupor. He'd run 3 blocks to where he'd seen the motorcycles parked outside Mickey's Diner, a group of leather-clad strangers who looked like they could take on the world. With tears streaming down his face, he'd approached them with the kind of desperate courage that only comes from loving someone more than you fear the consequences. "He hit my grandma," Tommy had sobbed, his small hands clutching the jacket of the nearest biker. "He pushed her down and she's hurt and my mom is crying and I don't know what to do. Please, please help her." Jack had knelt down to the boy's level, and in that moment, he'd seen his own grandson, the one he'd lost to a drunk driver 3 years ago. He'd seen every child who'd ever needed protection, every grandmother who'd ever deserved better, every silent scream for help that went unanswered. "Where's your grandma now, son?" Jack had asked gently. "At home, but my dad's there too, and he's scary when he drinks, and..." "Not anymore, he's not," Jack had said, standing up and turning to his brothers. "We ride." Now, standing on that porch with 23 pairs of eyes boring into him, Raymond Coulter was experiencing perhaps the first real fear of his life. These men hadn't said a word, hadn't made a single threat, but their presence spoke volumes. They stood like sentinels, arms crossed, faces impassive. The message was clear: we know what you did. And we're not leaving. Jack dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, each step measured and deliberate. When he reached the bottom step, he looked up at Raymond and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire street. "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go," Jack said. "You're going to step aside and let us check on Dorothy. You're going to stand right there while we make sure she's okay. And then you're going to listen very carefully to what I have to say. You got that?" Raymond's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He was a big man himself, had used his size to intimidate his family for years, but standing before this wall of leather and conviction, he suddenly felt very small. The front door opened, and Ellen appeared, her eyes red from crying. When she saw the bikers, confusion and hope warred on her face. Behind her, Dorothy sat in a chair, a bruise already darkening on her cheek, her wrist wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "Mrs. Dorothy," Jack called out, his voice transforming from steel to velvet. "My name is Jack. Your grandson asked us to check on you. Would it be all right if we came in?" Dorothy looked at this impossible scene, her son-in-law trembling on the porch, these fierce-looking strangers who somehow radiated safety rather than danger, and began to cry. Not from fear, but from relief. After years of trying to protect her daughter, of swallowing her pride and staying quiet because Ellen begged her to keep the peace, someone had finally come. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, please." What happened over the next hour was something the neighborhood of Maple Street would talk about for years. Marcus watched from the edge of the property as the bikers transformed from intimidating figures into something entirely different. One of them, a man with a long gray braid named Chuck, happened to be a paramedic. He examined Dorothy with gentle hands, checking her wrist and the contusion on her face. Another biker, a woman with fierce eyes and a heart-shaped face tattoo named Rita, sat with Ellen, speaking in low, urgent tones about resources and shelters and the fact that she didn't have to live this way. Tommy had emerged from his hiding place in the backyard and now sat on Jack's motorcycle, wearing a helmet 3 sizes too big, while Jack stood on the porch delivering what could only be described as a sermon. "I'm going to tell you something about strength," Jack said to Raymond, who'd been moved to the porch swing, flanked by 2 bikers who'd made it clear that running wasn't an option. "For years, I thought strength was about being the toughest guy in the room. Thought it meant never backing down, never showing weakness. I hurt people with that philosophy. People I loved." He paused, looking at the photograph he'd pulled from his pocket, a young boy with a gap-toothed smile. "That's my grandson, Ethan. He was 6 when a man who thought he was strong enough to drive drunk took him from us. You know what I learned that day? Real strength isn't about dominating people who can't fight back. Real strength is about protecting people who need it. It's about admitting when you're wrong. It's about choosing to be better than the worst version of yourself." Raymond sat in silence, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack continued, and now his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Dorothy is going to press charges if she chooses to. Ellen is going to make her own decisions about this marriage without you intimidating her. And you're going to get help, real help, for your drinking and your anger. We've got the number for a program that's helped a lot of men who stood exactly where you're standing now." He leaned in closer. "But understand this, we're going to be checking in. Every week, someone from the Guardians is going to ride through this neighborhood. We're going to talk to your neighbors, to your son's teachers, to Dorothy. And if we hear that you've laid one finger on anyone in this family, if we hear about a single threat, a single moment of intimidation, we'll be back. And next time, we won't just park outside. Are we clear?" Raymond nodded, and for the first time in what might have been years, something like genuine shame crossed his face. He started, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to be different." "Then you learn," Rita said, stepping onto the porch. "My ex-husband used to say the same thing right before he'd put me in the hospital. You know what changed? I left, I got help, I met these people who showed me that I deserved better. Now I ride with them, and we help other people see that they deserve better too." She pulled out a card and pressed it into his hand. "That's a number for a men's group that deals with anger and addiction. They meet twice a week. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call them. You're going to set up an appointment. And you're going to show up. Because the alternative is losing everything, your wife, your son, your freedom. And one day, when you're old and alone, you're going to realize that you had a chance tonight. You had people who cared enough to give you an opportunity to change instead of just calling the cops and washing their hands of you. We're still calling the cops, Jack clarified. What you did is a crime, and there have to be consequences. But we're also giving you a path forward. What you do with it is up to you. As if summoned, blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street. Tommy had apparently mentioned his grandmother's injuries to one of the bikers, and someone had quietly made the call. Officers Mike Torres and Sarah Chen had been patrolling nearby, and they'd responded with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. It wasn't every day you got a call about a domestic disturbance involving a motorcycle club. What they found defied their expectations entirely. Dorothy was being tended to by medical professionals who just happened to ride Harleys. Ellen was being counseled by advocates who wore leather instead of business suits. Tommy was surrounded by tough-looking men who were teaching him about standing up for people you love. And Raymond was sitting quietly, accepting full responsibility for his actions, with a card clutched in his hand and what looked like the first stirrings of genuine remorse on his face. Well, Officer Torres said, surveying the scene. This is definitely going in my report. Jack shook his hand. We're the Guardians. We ride through the state helping families in crisis. Young Tommy here flagged us down and asked for help protecting his grandmother. We made sure everyone was safe and called you folks to handle the legal side. Officer Chen was already talking to Dorothy, taking her statement, photographing her injuries. Raymond would be arrested, that was non-negotiable. But even in that moment, surrounded by the consequences of his actions, there was a strange sense of possibility in the air. The Guardians hadn't come for revenge or vigilante justice. They'd come because a child asked for help, and they'd stayed to ensure that help extended beyond just one night. Marcus, still watching from the shadows, felt tears on his cheeks. He thought about his own daughter, living 3 states away with a husband Marcus had never quite trusted. He thought about all the times he'd wanted to intervene but hadn't known how. He thought about the power of showing up. As the police prepared to take Raymond into custody, Ellen approached Jack with Tommy's hand held tightly in hers. Why? She asked simply. Why did you help us? You don't know us. Jack looked down at Tommy, who was still wearing that oversized helmet, and smiled. Because he asked. Because you deserved it, and because if we can't look out for each other, strangers included, then what's the point of any of this? He gestured to his club, to the motorcycles, to the whole scene. Every one of us has a story. Chuck over there, he was homeless for 3 years before we found him sleeping behind a gas station and helped him get clean. Rita, she barely survived what her ex put her through. Me, I lost my grandson, and I realized I had 2 choices. Let the anger eat me alive or turn it into something useful. We chose useful. Tommy suddenly pulled off the helmet and ran to Jack, wrapping his small arms around the big man's waist. Thank you, he said, his voice muffled against leather. Thank you for believing me. Jack knelt down one more time, this time with tears in his own eyes. You did the hard part, buddy. You asked for help. That takes more courage than most adults ever have. You protected your grandma tonight. You're a real guardian. He unpinned a patch from his vest, a small silver shield, and pressed it into Tommy's hand. You keep this, and you remember, real men protect people. Real men stand up for what's right. Real men aren't afraid to ask for help when they need it. Can you remember that? Tommy nodded solemnly, clutching the patch like it was made of gold. As the police car pulled away with Raymond in the back seat, Dorothy stood on the porch, supported by Ellen on one side and Chuck on the other. She looked at the assembled bikers, these warriors who'd appeared out of nowhere to answer a child's prayer, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Will you really come back? Ellen asked. To check on us. Every Sunday, Jack promised. Rain or shine. And you've got my number now. You need anything at all, you call. We've got resources, connections to shelters, job programs, whatever you need to build a new life if that's what you choose. He looked at Dorothy. Ma'am, you're going to be okay. You've got a brave daughter and an even braver grandson. And now you've got us too. As the Guardians prepared to leave, neighbors began emerging from their houses. They'd watched the whole thing unfold from windows and doorways, too frightened or uncertain to intervene when Raymond had been raging earlier, but drawn out now by the unusual sight of motorcycles lined up like protective shields. Mrs. Patterson from next door approached with a casserole, because even in crisis, some instincts were universal. Mr. Chen from across the street offered his guest room if Ellen and Tommy needed a safe place to stay. The Johnsons from down the block shared that they'd heard the fights, had been worried, but hadn't known what to do. In a single night, isolation had transformed into community. Marcus finally stepped forward, identifying himself as a neighbor of sorts, and asked Jack a question that had been burning in his mind. "How did you know? How did you know this was real and not just some kid making up stories?" Jack's answer was simple and profound. "We didn't, not for certain. But we figured the worst that could happen if we were wrong was we'd embarrass ourselves checking on someone who didn't need help. And the worst that could happen if we ignored him and he was telling the truth. That was unacceptable, so we showed up. We always show up." He paused, then added, 10 years ago, we were just a motorcycle club that liked to ride. Then one of our members, a guy named Bones, got a call that his niece was being abused by her boyfriend. He called us, and 15 of us showed up at that apartment. We didn't hurt anybody, we just stood there and made it clear that she wasn't alone anymore. She got out that night, started a new life, went back to school. She's a nurse now. After that, word spread. Other people started reaching out. We realized we could be more than just guys who liked bikes, we could actually make a difference. So we organized. We trained people in crisis intervention, partnered with social services, learned about domestic violence and addiction resources. Now we've got chapters in 12 states, and we've helped hundreds of families. Rita added, "We're not vigilantes. We're not trying to replace the police or social workers. We're just filling a gap. Sometimes people need to see someone show up before they believe they're worth helping. Sometimes a kid needs to know that the scary-looking bikers are actually the good guys. We be what people need in that moment." The Guardians left as dramatically as they'd arrived, engines roaring to life in a thunderous chorus. But they left behind something intangible and precious, proof that strangers could care, that help could come from unexpected places, that a single act of courage could spark a chain reaction of compassion. Tommy stood on the porch, clutching his silver shield patch, watching them disappear into the night. Ellen held him close, already planning her next steps, feeling the weight of years of fear beginning to lift. Dorothy sat in her chair, her wrist properly bandaged by Chuck, with a list of follow-up care instructions and 3 phone numbers for support groups. And Marcus walked home slowly, his mind reeling. When he got there, he didn't go to bed. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed a message to his daughter. "I love you, and I want you to know that if you ever need anything, anything at all, I will show up. No questions asked, always." He hit send, then searched for Guardian Motorcycle Club volunteer opportunities. 6 months later, Marcus would be riding with them, a new patch on his own vest, showing up for strangers who needed someone to believe them. Tommy would be doing better in school, seeing a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma, and telling anyone who'd listen about the night the bikers came. Ellen would have filed for divorce, moved into a small apartment with Dorothy and Tommy, and started a new job with health insurance. And Raymond would struggle. Some days he'd show up to his meetings, work his program, and slowly chip away at the rage and pain that had turned him into someone he hated. Other days he'd backslide, make excuses, try to convince himself that he was the victim. But he'd never touch his family again, because somewhere in the back of his mind, those motorcycles still rumbled, and he remembered what it felt like to face real strength, the kind that protected instead of destroyed. The story spread through social media, newspaper articles, and word of mouth. "He hit my grandma," the child cried. The bikers parked right outside his door became a rallying cry, a reminder that heroism doesn't always look like we expect it to. That sometimes the scariest looking people have the biggest hearts. That a child's cry for help should never go unanswered. And on Maple Street, on a blue house with a white porch, a silver shield sticker appeared in the window, a symbol that this family had guardians now, and that they'd never face darkness alone again. Because in the end, that's what we all need, someone willing to show up. Someone willing to stand between the vulnerable and harm. Someone willing to believe that every person, every child, every grandmother, every scared spouse, deserves to feel safe and valued and protected. The Guardians understood something fundamental about humanity: we're not meant to face our battles alone. And sometimes, all it takes is the rumble of engines, the glint of chrome, and the unshakable conviction that when someone cries for help, you answer. That night, as Tommy finally fell asleep clutching his silver shield, he dreamed not of fear but of possibility. He dreamed of growing up to be a man like Jack, someone who used their strength to protect rather than harm, who showed up when it mattered most, who proved that the world, for all its darkness, still contained people willing to be lights. And in living rooms across the country, other children heard this story and learned something essential: that help exists. That courage can come in unexpected forms. That when you stand up for what's right, sometimes the universe sends backup wearing leather jackets and riding motorcycles. The roar of those engines faded into the night, but their message echoed on: we're here. We care, and we're not going anywhere.